So welcome everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Real World Data and Real World Evidence 101. It's a little hard to say quickly, Real World Data and Real World Evidence. I'm Eleanor Perfetto, and we welcome you to this session. Next slide, please. For those of you who are new to the National Health Council, just wanted to let you know that we are a not-for-profit membership organization. And on this slide, you see depicted all of the patient advocacy organizations that are in our membership. So we have 5 different categories of membership, but via our bylaws, we must always have the largest group be the patient advocacy community. And you see 62 members here of the patient advocacy community, groups that are very large, like the American Heart Association or the American Cancer Society, and then other groups that are very small who represent rare disease and everything in between. Next slide, please. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. This webinar is being recorded and it's going to be available afterwards on our website. Please stay on mute throughout the presentation and submit any questions that you might have through the chat function. Next slide, please. We want to begin with some thank yous and acknowledgements. This program is funded through a Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, a Eugene Washington PCORI Engagement Award. And so we recognize PCORI as being our sponsor. We also had an advisory committee that helped us prepare these materials, and we want to thank them. That's Robert McBurney, Teresa Strong, Jennifer King, Debbie McCall, Lucinda Orsini, Jennifer Graff, Vanessa Bollinger, Susan Dosries, and Danielle LaValle. If you know any of these individuals, be sure to thank them for their contribution. We really appreciate the time and the work that they put into helping us prepare this program. Next slide, please. Let's walk through our agenda for today. Welcome and introductions, which we're going through right now. We're going to do an overview of the webinar series. We're going to talk about what are real-world data and real-world evidence, RWD and RWE. We're going to talk about a few case examples, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. Next slide, please. Let me introduce the team that's put this program together. Myself, Eleanor Perfetto with the National Health Council, Elizabeth Ehrlein with the National Health Council, and Sarah Gray also with the National Health Council. And we teamed up with folks from the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, and that's Narosha Mahendra, I always mess up Narosha's last name, Mahendra Ratnam, and Joy Eckert. Thank you very much for to our partners for working with us on this program at Duke Margolis. Next slide, please. So we're going to begin with a couple of questions because we want to know more about who's on the line and who's participating today. So if you would all answer this question, for the community that you represent, could it be choose patient community, academia, nonprofit organization, industry, or other? So please take the poll now. We'll give you a few seconds to answer. Silke, you want to put the poll results up, please? Oh, we have patient community, academia, many nonprofits, and then also many industry representatives, and then a small segment of other. Thanks very much. And then let's go with the second question. How would you rate your level of familiarity with RWD and RWE? I've never heard of it before. I've heard of it, but I don't know what it is. I don't know much about it. I am familiar and have worked with RWD and RWE, or I know so much I could give this webinar. Please rate yourself. Silke, want to show us what the results are? Oh, we've got a mix of very few people who are experts, quite a few people in the middle there who know some or know a little, and then those who are very new. So we really have a distribution. Thank you very much for answering those questions. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about an introduction to real-world data and real-world evidence. And this is going to be a training series that we're putting together under the program that we've been awarded by the PCORI. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Next slide, please. The goal is to expand patient community capacity to engage in real-world evidence research and the use of the data that comes out of it and the information. And it's going to be accomplished through the development and delivery of the webinar series, but also with a set of tools that will be coming as alongside this in alignment with the series itself. And our real goal is to be sure that there's patient centricity that gets inserted in real world evidence work and in the data and the studies that are performed. We want to see more patient centricity throughout. The next slide, please. The curriculum is going to be a webinar series, and it will include sources of real world data, privacy and patient generated data, diversity and representativeness in real world data sources, the role of real world evidence in regulatory decision making, evaluating the quality of RWE, co-developing patient-centered RWE, data capture in clinical settings, and some case examples. And then in our online classroom, which is being created to support all of this work, the classroom will have the toolbox, and that will include a glossary, infographics, and other guides, along with the recorded webinar series. Next slide, please. So to kick this off, we have the webinar that's going on today, but we also have several others that are scheduled. On November 6th, we're going to have sources of real-world data and an introduction to big data, and that will feature Elizabeth Airline from the National Health Council, Susan Doseries from the University of Maryland, and Sally Oken, who is formerly with a group called Patients Like Me. And on December 4th, we're going to talk about sources of real-world data and introduction to patient registries. Again, Dr. Airline will be involved, and we'll have the speakers Robert McBurney and Vanessa Bollinger, who will be on that webinar on December 4th. So we hope that you will register for those and that you will join us for those sessions. Next slide, please. So RWD and RWE 101. We're just going to kick off this series today and give you some foundational background information that will help you through the rest of the series. Next slide, please. Let's begin with some definitions. Before we kick this off and before we get into any specific topics when it comes to RWD and RWE, we want to make sure that everybody is on the same level playing field with understanding what the definitions are. So the definitions that we'll be using for RWD includes data about patients' health and the delivery of their health care routinely collected as part of getting care or daily living. So RWD can come from a variety of sources. It can come from electronic health records, health insurance claims and billing, mobile health apps, and surveys. RWD includes information that is not, it excludes information that would be collected in a traditional randomized clinical trial. So if it's trial data and it's a very traditional format for that trial, traditional methodology, that would not be considered RWD. RWD comes from data that gets collected in the real world. It gets collected providing care or as part of daily living. Real world evidence is the clinical evidence from research studies about the use and possible benefits or risks of an intervention. So what does that mean? It's when you're looking at clinical information that comes from real world data. So data that comes from getting care or daily living, and that evidence is examined, it's synthesized, and we get findings from that data, and that produces the real world evidence. In parallel, the FDA also has definitions that they use that are similar. So real world data for the FDA is data relating to patient health status and or the delivery of health care routinely collected from a variety of sources. And real world evidence is clinical evidence about the usage and potential benefits or risks of medical products derived from the analysis of RWD. Excuse me. So as you can tell from these definitions, they're in alignment with one another. And RWD are the actual data elements that are collected when someone's getting care or as part of their daily living, as opposed to real world evidence, which is the product of the analysis of that data. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit more about RWD. As we said, it's data about patients' health or how their health care has been delivered to them, and it's part of the routine of care provision. So here are some examples of sources of real-world data. Could come from insurance claims. So anytime a person sees a doctor in the doctor's office, or they go to a lab and have a lab test done, it could come from their electronic medical records. It could be part of the data that they provide as part of a patient registry. It could be part of data that comes from a survey that an organization might conduct to collect information directly from patients. It could come from social media. It could come from an online forum where people are putting in their experiences or their preferences. And it can also come from wearables or sensors. So for something like your Fitbit or your Apple Watch. So these are the places when we talk about the variety of sources where RWD comes from, it could come from any of these kinds of sources. And as you can see, these reflect what might happen in normal routine care or normal daily living. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a real-world database that might be collected. So as we said, there's a private insurance company or a public payer, such as Medicare or Medicaid. There are healthcare visits that patients might have with doctors or clinics, and that information gets sent to the insurance company or the payer. They get prescriptions from a pharmacy. That information gets sent to the insurance company or payer. There are procedures, tests, other kinds of things like lab tests that take place. And that information can all be sent to the insurer because those bills need to be paid by the insurance company. And that produces a database that's used for paying those bills, but it can also be used for a real-world data analysis. So this is just one example of where the data come from that can be used in collecting real-world data and in conducting a real-world data analysis. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit more about real-world evidence. In real-world evidence, it's clinical evidence from research studies that use the real-world data, that actually derive information out of the real-world data. So if we took the example that we just had prior, where it was information that came from a large insurance company or a payer, that's where the real-world data comes from. And as you follow the graphic along, that data become analyzed according to a research plan that's put together, and a report comes out, and that's the real-world evidence that was produced by analyzing the real-world data. Next slide, please. So why would we take the time to focus on real-world data and real-world evidence? Well, there are some things that have been happening in recent years that make this data more available and make the data more useful and usable. With the development of computers, smartphones, wearable devices, and other technologies such as biosensors, there are large quantities of these data that are out there being generated every day in real-world settings. They're stored, and there's a lot of benefit to looking at these data and doing an analysis. And real-world evidence complements and augments the findings that would come from a traditional randomized controlled trial. So if you think about a randomized controlled trial, you see to the left, in those trials, because they have inclusion and exclusion criteria that help the people who produce the trial or who are running the trial to select the patients, they all kind of look the same. They have to all be within a certain age range. They have to have certain characteristics. That can be very different, not always, but it can be very different from the kind of people that we see in real-world data. Real-world data captures everyone. It captures young, old, different shapes and sizes, different geographic regions, nationalities, ethnic backgrounds, different culture. So real-world data can augment the findings from clinical trials because it does collect data on a diverse population. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. How can RWE complement and augment real randomized clinical trial data? Well, it can capture a broad and more diverse patient population, as I said. It can address research questions that require large numbers of patients and longer follow-up periods. It can be very expensive to conduct a very large trial and conduct a very large trial for a long period of time. Those are two things that add great expense to clinical trials. Real-world databases that produce real-world evidence can help augment those trials because you can capture a larger population and you can follow them for a longer period of time than you might normally see in a traditional trial. It can address research questions that can't be studied by experiments because there might be ethical or feasibility reasons why those trials can't be conducted. So, for example, might be unethical to remove patients from a particular therapy or to add a particular therapy for some patients. But if you can look back in time and see where that happened as the course of care, and not because you were denying someone care or making them take something that might not be appropriate for them, then you can actually do the study by using the data that already exists and not putting any patients at risk. And then it provides evidence reflecting real-life treatment and real-life disease management. As I mentioned earlier, a clinical trial will have a protocol that dictates the way that care is provided and how often testing is done and how often that patient is seen. But that can be very different than what happens in real-life disease management. And so these are the ways that the evidence that comes from a real-world evidence study can complement traditional randomized controlled trials and their findings. Next slide, please. So here are some key differences that you might see between real-world evidence and randomized controlled trials. In traditional trials, you pretty much always see randomization. You very often see that the patients and the clinicians are blinded to treatment. But you don't see very often in trials diverse patients, but you would see that with real-world evidence. In real-world evidence, you can see longer-term outcomes. That would be rare in a clinical trial. Real-world evidence comes from the everyday environment. That would also be rarer in a clinical trial. You can study new uses for existing and approved medications with real-world evidence. You would see that more rarely for approved drugs. It does happen, but it's really usually more often seen in real-world evidence than for a whole new trial to be conducted. You can identify how medications are being used by doctors and patients in the real world. That's typically what happens with real-world evidence. That's more rare in a randomized clinical trial that's traditional. And then you can examine the costs of care. Again, very common in real-world evidence, but much rarer in clinical trials. So these are some ways that they can balance one another out and complement one another. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some case examples that you might be familiar with that you didn't realize at the time that you were learning about them actually reflect examples of real-world evidence. Let's talk about smoking and the use of tobacco products. When many years ago, probably almost 50 or 60 years ago now, we were learning a lot about the health effects of smoking. A lot of that data came from things like death certificates and hospital data, where the rate of lung cancer deaths was identified among heavy smokers, predominantly men, and it was found that it was 20 times higher than for non-smokers. So that was use of real-world data that led to national stop smoking efforts. There were no randomized controlled trials. It was observational data that was used. A second example that many parents are aware of is in Reye's syndrome. It was because of these studies in Reye's syndrome that we successfully reduced and in many cases eliminated the use of baby aspirin. Because we found that through using registry data, over 90% of children that had been affected by Reye's syndrome had recently used aspirin. And this led us to providing convincing evidence by successfully reducing and eliminating the use of baby aspirin, that it was the baby aspirin that had been the cause. And again, not a clinical trial scenario, but using real-world data from a registry. And lastly, the use of beta blockers with heart attacks. This was identified through the use of electronic medical records that beta blocker use was linked to a 40% reduction in death after a heart attack. And so it led to the widespread use of beta blockers being used in heart attack patients as a standard practice. So if you think about these examples that have become over many years common knowledge, they were based on the use of real-world data and process of real-world evidence, analyzing that data to produce that real-world evidence that led to practices that are common today in healthcare and in healthcare practice. The next slide, please. So there are many uses for real-world evidence in decision-making. Examples include measuring quality of care, comparing treatment effectiveness, regulatory decision-making, which we will have a session on as part of this series, to monitor adverse events, and to identify the cost of healthcare services. Next slide, please. So I'd like to address some questions if anyone has any. I can start off with one that came in a little bit earlier that said, where might you be able to find real world evidence about your own disease? Well, that's really a great question, because there are so many different disease groups that are represented in the National Health Council membership. You can turn to the patient groups that focus on those diseases. Very often those patient groups will have registries, or they will have surveys that they conduct about that disease. So those might be available on their website. There are also studies that are done that use real world evidence. And so you may see some of those studies that are on the internet that have been conducted using things like healthcare claims data or government survey data. Those are all studies that have been done, conducted using real world data and real world evidence that you might be able to tap into about a specific disease. I would recommend starting with the patient advocacy organization if there is one for the particular disease, and then also look to literature that you might find available through Medline or through Google, and some of the literature may be available on that patient advocacy website about the studies that they've done. Another question that's come through is diverse patients are those with comorbidities and differences, not just differences like age, gender, and ethnic groups. That's absolutely true. There's a lot of diversity in patient populations, especially with regard to the comorbidities that might have. And that is one of the things that you can identify in many of these real world data sources. So for example, if you were to look at the claims that an insurance company has, they may be looking at claims for a disease that might be a heart disease, but you would also be able to identify in that data that the person has diabetes, because you can see that they've been treated for diabetes in the past. So it can give you a really good look at what are the diverse comorbidities that the patient population might have, and how those comorbidities impact one another. You know, it's very common that we see one person who has multiple diseases and that they are having a tremendous impact on the treatments and outcomes for that individual. But a real world data analysis can take into consideration those comorbidities. A question was asked, this is an excellent question, are patients consenting to the use of their data? This is an excellent question, and it's a very timely question, and it's another one that we're going to have a conversation about as part of this series. Very often when you are receiving care or when you have signed up for an insurance plan, you may be consenting to things that you haven't realized that you're consenting to, that you are consenting to your data to be used in an anonymized way without your name or your identifying information, but in an anonymized way, you're consenting for your data to be used for these kinds of studies. It is important that you take a look at the kinds of things that you're agreeing to when you sign those papers in the doctor's office or sign those papers with an insurance company to understand whether or not you are consenting. This is not necessarily a negative thing. You may want to have your data used for research as long as you're being promised that there is privacy and security measures being followed so that your information is protected. Then your information can be used. But it is something that all patients need to be aware of in terms of how their data are being used and the permissions that they are allowing for their data to be used. But again, it's not necessarily a negative thing. You may want to contribute to research as long as you know that you're being protected and that your privacy is being protected. In looking through some more questions here, there's a question about data being collected from a variety of data sources, especially through social media and survey data. So yeah, there are different ways that organizations now, very large data organizations, are merging different types of data together. And so there is the ability to merge different kinds of survey data, with social media data, sometimes with other health insurance data. These are not usually being done on an individual basis, but might be done on a geographic basis, for example, because you might have information about people who live in a geographic location, and you have an idea of what their preferences are, or what their habits are, and you're able to take a look at that and do those mergers in that way. So there's different techniques that are being used to do all of this, and it's quite extensive in terms of the methodology that's being developed to be able to do it. It's new, it's emerging. It's one of the things that patients and patient groups will want to be following to learn more about, and to understand how their data gets input into these various sources, and the kind of information that can come out of it when these kinds of analyses are done, because it can be done can be done very well, and can provide a lot of information that can help us in terms of finding out new things that can be used in treatment and in new methodologies. But we've also seen examples where things might be abused. And so we really want to be conscientious about how the data are input, how they're used, and the type of data privacy and security that I was talking about earlier. Let's see, we've got, there's a question here that's a methodology question. It says, how do you control for internal validity in real world data? And I think that's a great question. Typically, we talk about validity of the data. A randomized controlled trial can have great validity in terms of the data collection, and it will have good what they call internal validity, because you know a lot about the patients that have been selected for that trial and the processes and how that data were collected. When it's real world data and real world evidence, we're thinking about that external validity. And there are so many things that might be able to impact that. And it really depends upon the data source, how the data were collected, how the data are cleaned, what you know about the individuals that are in that database, that can tell you really how good the data are at reflecting what's really happening in the real world, and what populations are really being reflected in that database and in that data analysis. Elizabeth, there are so many questions coming in now. I'm going to turn to you to see if you can help me sort through some of them, because there are so many. So if you see something that looks like it's important that I haven't been able to capture, just please jump in and raise the question.
Yep, I am sorting through all the questions as well and trying to respond to a few of them with some specific literature as well. I see that there's one question that came in from Eva about how can academic researchers evaluate the benefits of adding real-world data to a study concept? How does a researcher gain access to the right real-world data at a reasonable price?
Well, wow, that's a great question. And it depends on what someone thinks a reasonable price is. I think that there are more and more data sources all the time that are growing rapidly. And so there are many more data sources, and there are many more large data sources. And I think you're right in pointing out that many of them are very expensive in order to be able to access those. But there are opportunities out there. There are opportunities in partnerships. Some universities have developed, they have contracts with some of the data warehouses that will allow them to use their data in certain ways. I know that in my experience at the University of Maryland, we're able to access some different data sources at a reduced price because they are being used for student dissertations and things like that. And so there is academic pricing for many of these organizations. And then there are also partnerships that if you're partnering with the organization that has the data, you may be doing analyses with them on a particular topic. I know that Optum Labs is an organization that does partnerships like that. And there's some reduced pricing there for those kinds of circumstances. And other health insurance companies that make some of their data available. There's also data that's accessible through CMS, Medicare, Medicaid data. Again, you do have to pay for it, but those kinds of data can be a little bit less expensive because they are expecting people in an academic environment to use those data. And most academics will include the cost to purchase that data in the grants that they write for funding to be able to access that. I know I've worked in partnership with pharmaceutical companies where the companies have some data that they're able to make accessible. And when you're partnering with them, there is no charge for that data. So there are some ways of trying to partner to make some of these things more accessible.
Another point to add is that we'll be having the webinar specifically about patient registries in just a few weeks. And that is another source of real world data that's certainly available to academic researchers as well. One other question that I wanted to pose, and perhaps Nirosha, I believe you're on the call as well, and perhaps you could unmute yourself to answer this one, was from Greg about 2 adequate and well-controlled studies are required to establish the efficacy or effectiveness of medical products. Could one be an RCT to establish efficacy and one be a real-world evidence study to establish effectiveness?
I'm not sure Nirosha is there, but I can jump in if she's not. It's a great question, and yes, there has been policies and put in place that would allow for this. There are some criteria that have to be met, but to get approval for a new product, you can do one RCT if it is large enough, and that's one of the caveats. It has to have been large enough, and you must supplement that one RCT with other data, and the other data can come from a real world database. It can be real world evidence that can be added to that. It could also be a meta-analysis of other studies that might be smaller, but they would be RCTs. But yes, it's possible to do that, especially if the one RCT is large enough and strong enough in terms of methodology.
Great. And another question that came in from Kevin, which I think touches upon a really important point, is could you address partnerships and collaboration with data sources in terms of the importance of having local knowledge regarding the real world data source?
Well, I think that is a great question because I think you really have to understand the data source very well to understand what you can and cannot do with the data, and how you would interpret the data in the end. So really having a very clear understanding, as I said earlier, when you're talking about that external validity and internal validity in the studies, you know, the internal validity is going to be how well you're doing those studies when it comes to using data from someplace else. But that how good is that data is going to be very important, and you need to understand the knowledge about how it was pulled together and the circumstances that caused that data to come together to really understand what you can do with it and how you should be interpreting information that comes out of it. I think that's one of the points that we've been trying to make with the work that the National Health Council has been doing in this area, and it's that if you really want to understand how you can frame real world data analyses and questions in a patient-centered way, it really means that you should be talking to patients to having a good understanding of their experience, and have a good understanding of what might be reflected in a database and what might not be reflected in a database to help you frame your real world data question and help you frame the real world data analysis so that you have a better sense of what you're actually looking at and what might be missing. And that really can come from having a good patient engagement, learning more from patients about their experience with their disease and their treatments. It strengthens the analysis.
I think another important piece of it, and I think is a good practice for doing large studies, is to engage medical coders as well, to understand whether there was upcoding that might have been happening behind the scenes and what impact that could have on what you're seeing in a claims database in particular. But definitely an important topic. I want to get to a couple more questions. Where do patient-reported outcomes fall in the scope of real-world data? Are they valuable, or are you wanting/needing providers to be collecting the data for it to be considered valid?
This is a great question. You know, patient-reported outcomes are extremely important. and they can be a part of real world data. They very often are not, but they can be. And there are different aspects that can tell you how valuable the information is that you're getting out of them. Number one is whether or not the questionnaire was a good questionnaire to start with. And that really has little to do with whether it's being collected in real world data or whether it's being collected in a randomized controlled trial. It has to be a good, strong instrument that has, and many people use the term validity, but it's more than validity. It's having what is called good psychometric properties. So if that questionnaire has good psychometric properties, then it has to have good psychometric properties for the circumstances that you intend to use it in. So do you know that it has good properties in the clinical trial setting? Do you know it has good properties in the real world setting? If you're confident that it does have good properties for using in the real world setting, then the databases that collect that data under those circumstances will have valuable data that you'll be able to use. But I think there's a couple of check marks here that you have to make. Was the questionnaire that you're using, is it patient-centered? Were patients actually engaged in the development of that questionnaire? Do we know what outcomes are important to them? What concepts are important to them? And did we build that questionnaire around those concepts that are important to patients? And did we build it with patients, collecting data from them as we went along? That tells you that you'll achieve those good psychometric properties. And then the second is, was it designed for the circumstance that it's being used in? Was it used for the place where you're collecting that data? That could be in a doctor's office. It doesn't have to be. It could be the patient doing it on their phone. It could be the patient, a questionnaire that they're filling out on their iPhone or on their computer, or in other ways. The questionnaire has to be known to work under those circumstances, or known to work well under those circumstances. If you can check some of those boxes, then you're probably getting good enough data through that RealWorld data collection that you could use it for a lot of different things.
Definitely. And actually, this is going to be one of the topics we're covering with a specific webinar on the role of PROs as a source of real world data in the springtime. So stay tuned for that. Another question that came in is with regards to data ownership or control. How much control or ownership do patients have of their data post-consent?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think we recognize that when a patient's in a clinical trial, they're actually told after they consent that they can retract their consent if they want to, and not have to be consented to be in that clinical trial. This is a little bit more difficult when we're talking about real world data, because it depends on how that data are being collected, and whether or not that person was even conscious of the fact that they consented. It's hard to pull back, or to make the decision to pull back a consent when you don't even know that you signed one. So if you know that you signed one, typically it will say in the consent that you can go back and remove that consent. But the infrastructure and the mechanisms for doing that are very difficult. And so even though patients have the right to be able to remove their consent, rescind that consent, or get data ownership after they've consented, it's very difficult to actually execute on that. And hopefully there are mechanisms that are being developed. We've heard of different mechanisms that are being developed to give patients the control to be able to do that. Unfortunately, they're not widely available.
Another important aspect of the data ownership is with regards to geography. Even is there are certain rules that have emerged in Europe, that have emerged in California, that can have impact on this specific question as well. So that's another area to take a look at, and that we can cover as part of our upcoming webinar that'll focus specifically on data privacy.
Yes, that is important, because as I said, there are actions being taken, but it's not widespread.
Another question was with regards to data linking is, and I think that this is one that we all struggle with, but how to collate real world data from so many varied data sources, especially social media and survey data.
Yeah, and that's one where you really have to understand, you really got to, it takes expertise to be able to do these kinds of things, to be able to do the matching. And as I said earlier, sometimes it's not sometimes you will know who the people are because you have been given permission to do that, but that's very rare, and that takes a lot of approvals to be able to know who people are to do the matching. So for the most part, matching can be done based on gender and age and those kinds of things that are more kind of can tell you that you're matching like people, but you don't know that you're matching the identical people. It's difficult to do. It has to be done well, and it really takes expertise to be able to pull those kinds of things together, to be able to do appropriate kinds of matching to merge those data sets.
Great. And possibly one final question is real world data most often retrospective, or are there prospective studies based on real world data rather than a traditional randomized control trial?
Yes, so very good question. Yes, traditional real world data is typically retrospective data. There can be circumstances, for example, in the case of registries, where you're collecting the information prospectively, but typically it's retrospective data. It's data that exists in claims, in medical records, et cetera. But that's the traditional route.
Right. Well, we're nearly at time. So if we could go to the next slide, please.
Yeah, so just a reminder, upcoming webinars, November 6th, the sources of real world data and an introduction to big data, and then December 4th on sources of real world data and introduction to patient registries. So please mark your calendars, register, and join us for these upcoming webinars. Next slide, please. Please don't forget to fill out an evaluation. You are going to be getting an email after this webinar is over, and we ask that you please fill out the evaluation. It's very important to us. We always are trying to improve, and so your evaluation will tell us about what we did well and what we can be improved upon. And we strongly encourage you to fill out those evaluations, and the link will be sent to everyone in an email. The slides and the presentation will be available on our website, so the recording will be available and you will get information about how to access that. Next slide, please. Join our mailing list and you will be automatically getting information about upcoming webinars and other information as it becomes available. We want to thank you. Thanks for joining us. We hope you'll join for more of the sessions.